Well, it's very good to be able to welcome George Lings from the Church Army to Leicester, and for me personally to renew a friendship as well from my own time living in Sheffield as well. Thank you, George, for all that you and your team have been doing in terms of research on behalf of the Diocese of Leicester, as indeed I know you're doing much wider research for the National Church at the moment as well. But just to recap for people, and I'm coming very new to this myself, obviously, but my understanding is then that in 2010, Diocesan Synod in Leicester discerned God's calling to set a very, very bold sense of calling around as many fresh expressions of church as inherited models of church. That was agreed by a Diocesan Synod. My understanding is that you came in 2012, I think I've got that
June
right?
and September. Yeah.
Okay, so to do an initial round of research to see where the diocese was, almost as a sort of benchmark, if you like, as we were beginning on a new journey. Then 2014, we were very fortunate to get a grant from the Church Commissioners, the National Church, to be able to employ 3 pioneer development workers who've been with us since October 2014. So now you've just come back again, 2016, to do a second round of research with us to try and see where we are now with fresh expressions of church. So I think probably my starting point is to want to ask you, when you're researching about fresh expressions of church, what are you actually looking for? I mean, in summary, what is the definition of fresh expression of church that you're working with?
I think I need to try to make it simple. Probably it's related to the 3 words themselves. Fresh expression is something about wanting to make contact with people, and we would say we're looking for 2 things. We're looking for those ways of being church which are trying in a new way to get in contact with people who are not currently attenders. If you wanted a technical word for that, you might say missional, and it may need to be fresh because so many people are disconnected from church. But the other thing is, it's not just a journey outwards. Sometimes the church goes on a journey out, but then to bring people back to existing church. Now, clearly that's not wrong, but this is a different journey, and that's the second thing. This is a fresh expression of church. It's a journey outwards to get to people who are not currently attending, but then with them to form church. And again, if you wanted a technical word, you'd say ecclesial. So maybe, it's a bit like the only bit of chemistry people know, H2O, hydrogen and oxygen. If you've got one, well, that's great, but it's not water. Put together missional and ecclesial, put together fresh expression and church, roughly speaking, that's what it is. That's not a particular type. They can appear in all kinds of ways. I mean, so, it's a bit like the word human. It doesn't tell you what gender, it doesn't tell you what age, it doesn't tell you what ethnicity. It's a very wide word. Fresh expressions of church is a term a bit like that, which is why sometimes it takes some explaining.
That's really helpful and very clear in terms of explanation, and certainly for me helpful. I mean, my own background as a parish priest and having and worked in a church where a number of people discerned a calling to pioneer ministry, and particularly around reaching particular groups of people in the wider community. Yeah. And so they were then involved in helping set up fresh expressions of church in that community. One area of confusion, though, that sometimes arises within this, when it comes to certain types, as you were just mentioning, I mean, messy church will be an interesting example. Yeah. So been a whole wave of of messy churches that have started up over recent years, and yet sometimes they fall within the definition of fresh expression of church, and sometimes they don't. Yeah. Do you want to just explain something more about that?
Yes, it's about the 2 journeys. It's the journey out and then what happens. And a number of messy churches, and it's a perfectly valid thing to do, are begun by a church in order to be a sort of stepping stone back to real or proper church. So the journey shape is like this, and in one sense it's just one U-shaped journey. And those kinds, we'd say that's fine, it's a mission project, or it's a sort of a stepping stone to something else. But other kinds say no, we know that's not going to work for us because the people we're in touch with, actually they probably won't get traditional church. So not only will we go out to them, but then we'll continue the journey with them and be church with them in their culture. And those are the ones that we would include. And you're right, some are included, some are not. It's not that one is right, one is wrong. They're just different, and it's helpful to be accurate about what's going on, because otherwise you don't get the expectations right. And some of the difficulty is that people who have not recognised that the fresh expression of church is on a journey to fully to become church, actually that's not supported or understood, and sometimes it's perceived as a threat by the sending church. So to be clear is not about right and wrong, it's more about being accurate and therefore having appropriate expectations.
Again, very, very helpful distinction, isn't it? I remember as a parish priest myself and being asked the question, why you're putting all these resources into pioneering mission and so on, why aren't we seeing more people in church on a Sunday?
We had the same when I was a vicar down in Canterbury Diocese. We had a church which was becoming reasonably full, but we were conscious there were so many other people outside in the town around us who didn't go anywhere. And we were conscious too that we were of a particular style. We were sort of, I don't know, Anglican Classic FM or something like that. But we knew that most other people in the culture around us were Radio 2 or Radio 1 listeners. So we said, well, perhaps we're being called by God to start something else as well, a kind of Radio 2 church. And that's what happened way back in the 90s.
So coming on to the research then that you've just been conducting for us, as I say, 2 years on from when you last looked at things here. From my point of view, the headline statistics are encouraging, very encouraging, but also contain some questions within them. So in terms of numbers of new fresh expressions of church, first of all?
Well, there used to be, we think, 53 and now 72. So that's quite an increase, about half a dozen a year. And because of needing to try to measure things accurately so that you can have confidence in the numbers, all we've done is actually taken the story up to the end of 2014, but we know it goes on. We know there are others in 15 and there are already others in 16, but we needed to measure a whole complete year, so we've only actually gone up to 14 at the moment, so there's more work to do. But there are about 20 more, and that certainly is encouraging.
Okay, and potentially another 5 or 10 in the
Indeed
last
so.
year or two, so
Indeed
maybe even as many as 20, 25, 30.
Yeah.
But that's also then held alongside the fact that a number of fresh expressions of church started up in previous years have now stopped and come to the end of their natural life, in a sense, as churches.
Yes, they have. And I think because these are communities of people, we need to take seriously that the stopping mattered. It wasn't just an interesting experiment that people decided, well, you know, we'll turn off the white rats now, it doesn't matter. This is actually a group of people. So sometimes we use the language of died, sometimes we use stopped, sometimes we use closed. And yes, there are now 17 of the total number which have stopped. And there's probably learning too in the stopping story. Not everything we try works. And a level of risk is to be celebrated. The Church of England has sometimes perhaps been unduly safe. On the other hand, we don't want to be irresponsible and have a disproportionate death rate.
I mean, I'm hugely encouraged, as I said a moment ago, just in terms of the numbers. I mean, it's not just about numbers of fresh expressions of church. No. Far more important to me is that represents some 400 or maybe even more new people, effectively, who are part of those church communities.
To the end of 2014, about 414 as far as we can calculate it, and if you include the 15s and 16s, it'll be more than that. What I think is particularly interesting and encouraging for Leicester is the continued increase of under 16s. Now we know in a national church we are an ageing, greying church. So to have under 16s growing and now a third at least of that membership is very encouraging, and actually it's twice the number on average that you find in parish congregations. So encouraging for the future.
I'm hugely excited by that, and given that all this was a large part of my own sense of calling to coming here, it's very, very encouraging to hear it. But just to unpick a little bit more the reasons for those that have stopped over the last few years, is a lot of that to do with leadership, do you think?
I think looking at the stats, and it's a small number, therefore quoting percentages is a bit dodgy, but if you said 4 out of 10 cases, something like that, something to do with leaders, and it seems to be 2 things. Sometimes it's leader burnout. Leading a young church is actually a demanding thing to do. And often people are doing it spare time or part-time, so they've got a whole life, as well as doing that. And the other thing that we've seen is the initial leader not being replaced. Now sometimes that's structural, something like a curate moving on, but other times it's not that simple. And it would be good if we can grow a culture that as soon as a leader starts, we're asking the question, what about succession? What about people who can work with that person, learn the skills, so that we get over this hurdle? because it's not just a Leicester problem, it occurs nationally.
Indeed. There's some real lessons for us to learn there, and that's something we will be taking away and doing quite a bit more thinking about. Another encouragement for me within the research that you've done, though, is that these fresh expressions of church are growing up across a very wide range of contexts, so from the urban to the suburban to the rural. And also within different traditions, so it's not just any one tradition of the church, but a good range of traditions who are all involved in this, which for me, again, is hugely encouraging. But I wonder within that, so there's some particular lessons around discipleship. It's obviously a key question for every church. What is it that you think maybe fresh expressions of church have to teach the wider church, maybe around lessons of discipleship and vocation, that sort of thing?
I think the broad picture of that actually is it's a two-way learning. I mean, it would be arrogant of a young movement like Fresh Expressions of Church to set on one side 2,000 years of learning of how you follow Jesus better. So, I mean, lessons from monasticism, old and new, lessons from people who have been encouraging people to grow in their gifts and so on. All sorts of lessons to come to the Fresh Expressions movement. I think probably all we can say is it's easier to talk about a topic like that than actually in practice to measure it. So all we asked people were, are you meeting with some of your people who are coming one-to-one? Are you in small groups with them? Do you provide any courses by which they could grow? And what about growing because they're just serving in teams? And that's a particularly interesting dynamic. And in some churches, what we see is people who would say, well, I'm not yet a Christian, but I really like what you do. Could I be a helper? Actually, the answer is yes. And almost by the doing of it, actually more than of Christ is discovered. So perhaps that is one of the lessons the younger churches are learning. Because they are new, in a sense, they're like toddlers learning to walk. There's a freshness of the lessons they're learning, and that might be just an illustration of one of them. But encouraging in the set in Leicester, by the measures of, are you discipling people? Are you holding communions? Are you holding baptisms? And what about taking responsibility for your own money and leadership and so on? All of those indicators, actually they're growing. So it's like watching, I don't know, a child at primary school, gaining new skills, learning new lessons, enjoying life, something like that.
I love that sense of mutual learning, actually, that this is, yes, as you say, a young movement which has much to give to the wider church, but also much still to learn as well. And I find that particularly encouraging. And I think for me, probably the overriding message, though, from this research in terms of the diocese and my role within the diocese as well, actually, is that we've made a very encouraging start on all of this, that the numbers are showing us that actually we can be encouraged by that and genuinely give thanks to God for it all. But that actually the trajectory of trying to reach as many fresh expressions of church as there are inherited models of church means that there's going to have to be a step change in terms of resourcing all of this, that we're not on the right path yet to be able to reach that number.
And because you're doing something that nobody else has yet done, nobody actually knows exactly what that path will look like. And it may be that actually you have a slower start as the plane sort of runs down the runway and then climbs, and then we will have to see. But I very much like the attitude which I think I see here, that it's that mixture of bold adventure but also dependency on God. We must not get into a merely managerial church and say because we've set a goal it will happen. I mean, this is probably lunacy. But the setting of some feeling of a calling, we think this is what God is pressing us towards. Well, I think, and what I think I see in Leicester is a right mixture of dependence on God, because in the end only He will call people, and yet being clear-eyed and saying, so what has happened so far, what are we learning? And that mix seems to me to be healthy.
Well, thank you, George. We hugely appreciate all your help and your encouragement on that journey.